when we gathered yesterday and I shared some of the reflections, and again, I thank you for enduring sort of my just personal things that I wanted to share, we're all whole people, and one of our realities is whole and healthy leaders. So just wanted to remind you that you have on your tables little booklets. They look like that's up on the screen. They're multicolored. The print is rather small, but we want you to know that the major areas that I'm going to go over today. A lot of the four major areas: vital congregations, whole and healthy leaders, collaboration, and prophetic voice, as our main focal points as a staff, have been endorsed, approved by our Synod Council as we move forward as our vision statement, our priorities, if you will. Now, the strategic objectives have not, any more than the Synod Council approves exactly how we do the call process. That's more of a management and a strategy kind of a thing that we're doing on the staff. But you can read my introduction, but I just wanted to highlight why this came to be. And I think most of us realized it certainly needed to be. When I came on staff 3 years ago, first of all, I tried to get everybody to stay who already was on staff, because I had no idea what that particular job entailed. And some of the folks had been on for a long time, and in fact, everybody did stay, at least for several months, and then just the natural reality of things, mostly retirements. People have moved on, and as we had 3 brand new staff people this past year, really 4 if you count Joe Reen in the called position, and a half-time position now with social justice and advocacy, we began to say, and folks began to ask me, okay, now you can't just keep leaning on the people who used to be here. What are we supposed to be doing? And I'm like, no, you're supposed to be telling me that, but wait a minute, you're newer than I am. And so I said, you know, we all want to be on the same page in terms of what we prioritize and what we want to be doing. And so we met together several times, really, as bishop staff and program staff, we call it. We have support staff, bishop staff, program staff, but we're all one office of the bishop. Let me digress for a minute. Would everybody who works on the North Carolina Synod staff stand up? Let me tell you, and some of them are not in this room right now because they're doing the behind-the-scenes work. There's people like Catherine way in the back, and of course Tammy's back in the corner. Many of you know Diane. You got to love Diane. I have colleagues who call just to speak to Diane. North Carolina Lutheran Synod. So we absolutely adore her. And this is a wonderful group of people. Can we thank our Synod staff for the work that they do? That was Kathy, who stood up next to Diana, and of course, who all else is out there? Michael, you've seen, he's in the back, and Lauren Thoreau is probably out there working. Diane is out there. Rick Godby, who does a lot of our stuff that I have no idea. Rick, my computer's not working. Help me. I know nothing. And he does the website. And Rick is almost full-time now. He was half-time, but he's picked up a lot of responsibility for us. We just are very grateful for all of our Synod staff. And we have a few part-time folks that work there as well. But we got together and decided that we, with new folks, we needed, and with a new time in the life of the church, we needed a new vision. The other thing was an observation that Synod means walking together, and most of us had experienced most of the time that we aren't. And what would it look like if we did? And how could we do that better? One of the things that I have said from the beginning, and it's even a stronger feeling that I have now, I just don't have a lot of energy and feel called in particular to things that to preserve the North Carolina Synod, unless it's doing something that help our congregations and help bridge that from the church-wide and global kind of ministry we have in the local congregation, that if we're enhancing that as best we can, I mean, that's exciting. We don't have a synod without congregations, and we don't have congregations in our polity without rostered ministers, in some capacity to serve them sacramentally and with word and with serving. So how can we facilitate that gospel ministry of Jesus? It sounds very simple, but when you come up with a vision statement, it's kind of like the Reformation and even times before 500 years ago, when the reformers, when they would reach a point where they couldn't quite figure out exactly where they needed to go, and there would be many, many differences of opinion and many, many camps of what they ought to be and who the church ought to be, it was always ad fontes. Back to the font, back to the source. If we can get back to the basics, if we can kind of pull it in, then we can come back out. So that's what we tried to do as a staff, and then brought on board with conversations in December and March, our Synod Council, and now we're inviting you just to understand a little bit about what we're hoping and trying to do. One of the things that we're hoping and trying to do is listen to you. Rather than our come up with programs that we think would be really neat that you might want to try, we want to hear what you all need and where things are going not so well. If the call process is not helping out, or if this particular program is not, then we want to do better with that. So, all of that said, vital congregations. Now, you've seen that a lot. You've seen it with the church-wide, with Dan's presentation yesterday. You'll see it lots and lots more. What's different about that? Well, we always want our congregations to be vital. That's the word, vitality, life, life-giving. That's really what we mean by that. But we're truly trying in the wider church and in the North Carolina Synod, in my heart and our staff's heart and mind, to help our congregations be in life-giving relationships with each other, first of all with God and with each other and with their communities in meaningful ways. That's what we want to help enhance and help facilitate. The measure that we've used, practically speaking, for years, no matter what we're looking at, has often been sustainability. And that's where a lot of anxiety happens in our congregations, because they don't know if they're sustainable. They don't know if they're going to make it. There aren't as many people as there used to be in a lot of our congregations. That's not true across the board, but in a lot of our congregations. And so, again, people are anxious about that. I've said it before. I need to say it again. I think we need to remember our whole kind of liturgical movement. I think of Ash Wednesday. How freeing that is, and yet how sobering it is at the same time to come forward and have somebody pretty much look us right in the face and say, you're going to die. Or just right there in front of everybody, somebody tells us, you're going to die. But by embracing the reality that we are finite, that, when the great church victorious shall be the church at rest, the ultimate reality of this is we're not going to be, because we'll all be gathered around the throne singing praises to the Lamb and reconciled in all relationships of all creation, and that whole vision that we have and that we trust and that we're moving toward. And in the meantime, we're the church militant, and we're not the church permanent. I've said before, and I don't mean to just be condescending about this, but to a lot of our smaller congregations, if we could say that we have a shelf life, if we could say that we have an expiration date, I know that I do. I know that my mom and dad did and found theirs this past year. But that's not the be-all and the end-all. It's not just, when I say institution, I'm not just talking about the church-wide. I'm not just talking about the synod. I'm talking about congregations as institutions. That we want those important realities in our lives to be as strong, as life-giving as possible. And when we get caught up in the sustainability obsession, I think we're already toast at that point. We have some pretty strong scriptural basis for that we often apply it to individuals, but I think it applies to congregations and institutions as well, that whoever would save their life, you're going to lose it if that's what you're about. And whoever would lose it, that's the way you find yourself, is by giving yourself away. And so even with our funding streams now that come from our church-wide expression, Danielle is technically a called person from the church-wide entity. Directors of Evangelical Mission are deployed staff people of the ELCA working and helping connect us to those funding streams, often our mission support of a little over $1 million. Then a big portion of that comes back to help us in this work of being more vital in our congregations, life-giving, and to focus on that. So one of the things, if you take the Congregational Vitality Survey that the ELCA has, which we can provide to you, speak to Danielle, is you might be viable but not sustainable. But see, the whole deal is your job, your calling, my calling isn't to die. That's going to happen. That's going to happen. None of the churches St. Paul established in any of those wonderful towns that he wrote letters to, none of those congregations is open today. But they paid forward the gospel in ways that it was planted elsewhere, and the church is shifting in all sorts of ways. Our job is simple as it sounds, is to live. But I think I need to be reminded about that a lot. I can get completely obsessed with the dying part, or the diminishing part, or this or that. But our job is to live. So vital congregations, kind of like with our Roman Catholic sisters and brothers when we sat down to have the declaration on the way. What does it mean ecumenically to be Lutherans and Roman Catholics, especially around the 500th commemoration of the Reformation? Well, if you start on the negative side, we just walk away before we ever even talk. You have to start with the positive things. What are the good? What are the life-giving things? How are you making a difference in your community? That's where we want to put our energy. That's where we want to put money. That's where we want to put... it's not that sustainability doesn't matter, because there are stewardship issues that come up with that. But to be vital. So anyway, we will be talking about that in a lot of ways, but that's the thing we want to invite you to participate with us in, is finding the ways that we can be vital and remembering, and this jumps to kind of number 3 already, but remembering that one of the best ways that we can be vital is to do it together, to collaborate, to share in ways that we have not before. If we ever had the luxury of being a silo, and of course that's an old analogy because people don't use silos anymore. They use these things they dig in the ground to put their grain in, most farmers now, but not these individual realities. How are we stronger together? That's what a synodical expression is trying to help enhance and figure out, not contrive. Because if we're contriving it, then we need to say, please don't send us mission support. You do it because you're doing it better. We're doing all that stuff because we believe that there are ways that we can coordinate and put this together maybe in some better and more life-giving sort of ways for everybody. So we intentionally put vital congregations first. It's not a contest, but I said yesterday that, when I was doing a Q&A in a Sunday school class, just as sincerely and kindly as you please, when I said, does anybody know what a synod is? What does synod mean? And that's when the woman said, it's a union for pastors. And that's not, goodness gracious, we certainly become advocates for our rostered ministers in many contexts, because it's a partnership and you want to be advocates but not choosing sides. Again, in our polity, we need, with word and sacrament and word and service, we need, and we value, I think we do, educated, healthy, whole leaders in this church. I can tell you that there's probably not any superhero pastor in this synod or in this whole church-wide expression who can be the be-all and the end-all and can get everything to change in your church if we just get a pastor in, especially a young pastor. That's what we hear often. By the same token, if we have a pastor who's not well, who's overwhelmed with debt or depression or substance abuse or relational struggle or just any number of other situational kind of circumstances, has become a lone ranger. Probably things are not going nearly as well in that congregation as they could be. And so we need to, at the same time, be investing mutually. Not something that the synod comes in as the synod entity or expression of the church and says, now we're going to make your rostered minister really whole and healthy. That's largely going to happen in the congregation itself. And how can we mutually be accountable to one another? Maybe renewal and tweaking and maybe recreation of a mutual ministry committee that expresses in a very intentional way. In the conflict that I have been addressing so far, my question is almost always to the council president when I get a phone call. So, have they met with the mutual ministry committee yet? And I usually get, the what? If you don't have one of those, we can help you establish one of those. The other thing is you don't just meet when there's a problem. Because prevention is a whole lot better than trying to put out fires when lines have been drawn and people have gotten real squirrely about things on the congregational side or the leader side. One of the things that the ELCA is now really mandating that we do is continuing education for our clergy. I mean, one of the things where we run into a problem with that is we do have actually several congregations of which I'm aware, because they've been rather straightforward to me about it. They don't work for you, they work for our congregation. I think they work for Jesus. But the thing is, your barber, your auto mechanic, your beautician, the people who do your nails, the people who do just about anything in your life, massage therapist, they have to get recertified. School teacher, nurses, doctors, everybody has to stay on top of things. And it's also one of the ways that we hold one another in a good way accountable. A lot of times I think accountability seems like an oppressive word. I don't see accountability at all as an oppressive word. I see that as a real gracious invitation for us to be accountable, to have clarity, to say, hey, look, have you done your boundary training about sexual misconduct and other sorts of things? Have you done that in the last 3 years? Have you done, anti-racism training? Have you done those things? Because we all do this together. So we're trying to keep up with that and to give as many opportunities as we can for things like coaching, first call theological education, any number of realities, but they go together really hand in hand. It's not an either or, but vital congregations and healthy leaders. We pretty well, like I said, know every now and then you have a very unhealthy leader with a still pretty healthy congregation, but that doesn't happen much. We don't see that much, because if somebody's not in a good place, the congregation's probably not going to be in a good place for very long. So collaboration, again, just obvious that that's a part of what we are about. But when we say collaboration, we want to be very, very intentional about being aware of, engaging and tapping the resources of the church-wide expression of collaboration, where we can do things together. We want to be very aware of our ecumenical partners. We've got quite a number of situations and quite a number of other ones sort of on the back burner that might emerge of Lutheran Episcopal partnerships, a few Lutheran Moravian ones. We hadn't figured out the Methodist thing yet because of their assignment, the way they move pastors. We can't quite figure out how that works with us. Some Presbyterian connection, and so we're hoping to do more and more of that sort of thing. I think one of the pictures in here is one of the most prolific realities of collaboration that just makes a lot of sense, where our local community might have, even if they have a lot of young people in confirmation, but mostly when Each congregation has 2, 3, 4 people, and so they get together with 3 or 5 other congregations and do their confirmation instruction, or their vacation Bible school, or both. Where are the places where we're stronger together? There is such a thing as critical mass, to make something exciting, and I think a lot of our congregations, could benefit from that. What's standing in the way of that? What's always standing in the way of such relational things? It's trust, isn't it? That we're afraid that if they meet Pastor Y down the street, they'll realize Pastor Y is quite vibrant and really wonderful, and they might leave our church and go over to theirs. So I think that it's important among our rostered ministers to have a lot of conversation. I'm going to be talking with our dean some about this in August when we meet, but to have conversations about how we nurture relationships among our pastors in a conference, so that what is the etiquette? What are the rules? For instance, somebody from a neighboring congregation shows up in your congregation for a baptism. Well, that's not a huge deal. People go to other churches for a baptism, but then they come for the next 2 weeks as well, and there is no baptism, and you know that they're members somewhere else. I think it's entirely appropriate, and I would even say expected, that the pastor in the new congregation where this family is going owes it to their colleague to call and say, look, I don't know if you're aware, but the so-and-so family, they came for the baptism. I thought, well, that's nice, but they keep showing up, and they came to choir practice Wednesday night. You might want to, if you don't know about this, let me inform you. They're certainly welcome here, but we don't want to be undermining one another, stealing each other's people when we have worries about budgets and this and that and the other. So we just need to be, we need to understand we're on the same team, and we want to try to enhance that as much as we can. Prophetic voice. And again, I'm not going over these strategic objectives. You see how that's arranged with under each heading, things that we're already doing that we understand that we need to keep doing, because some of those things just have to happen. But what's a prophetic voice, and what do I mean by that? Well, to some extent, mentioned that in preaching yesterday. The prophets, which are not all the same, of course, don't necessarily primarily foretell, like fortune tellers, as much as they foretell. They proclaim. They also claim to say, "Thus says the Lord." Of course, there are false prophets everywhere, but the ones that we have canonized and the ones that we look to and the ones that Jesus seems to quote and follow in their path in his own working, saying that, when the scroll, he picks up the scroll of Isaiah and reads and says, hey, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And so Jesus made a choice at that point. It wasn't, it wasn't the school of King David that we also have in Scripture, which is Scripture as well. But, when King David is getting ready to take Jerusalem, Salem, from the Jebusites, and the Jebusites stand up on the towers and taunt David and say, even with an army full of blind and lame people, we could still beat King David's army. He can never take Jerusalem, and he did. And then lined them all up, the blind and the lame, on both sides, and ran a sword through them. That's King David, and Jesus is the son of David, but not like David. He's with the prophets, where the scroll of Isaiah says, hey, the eyes of the blind are going to be open. The lame man will leap like a hart. The tongue of the dumb will sing for joy. That all of these marginalized and oppressed folks, that's a prophetic witness. It's also a defining of justice in a very Hebrew sort of way, in a very prophetic sort of a way. Justice that's not the Greek deal with the scales where you get what you deserve, you get what's coming to you, which often means punishment. Well, he deserved that. That's he made his own bed. There certainly is that biblical witness, and perhaps there's a strong place in the life of faith for that tough kind of a voice. But the witness of Jesus and the witness of the prophet seems to be with regard to justice, that it's not that you get what you deserve, but that each has what she or he needs, which is a hugely different reality. And so a prophetic voice, and I will say because I sort of got this going, my emphasis on we've got to get together a context where we're intentionally in the North Carolina Synod talking about justice and about advocacy. The world just needs that voice. The church certainly needs that voice, and we all have different ideas. See, here's part of where we still get tripped up, is one person's justice issue sometimes is another person's sin, right? And so even within this church, that happens. And so we get caught up in some of those realities. So it's not a perfect science by any stretch. It's more of an art of being in relationship, and how can you draw up a perfect scientific way to be in relationship with someone? You can't. It's way more complex than that, except to always be following the ultimate law of love and to be pursuing justice. Justice, mercy, love, righteousness, these realities. The advocacy piece I mentioned yesterday a little bit has to do with the church's call, the Christian's call in our baptism in various ways that we're called to discern of where does power reside in the life of the church, in the life of the community. Who has a voice that matters, a voice that can do something? Who doesn't have that voice and that opportunity? And how might we speak for the ones without a voice? For children, for widows and orphans, even as we proclaim our festivals and feasts and make our sacrifices, and 10,000 rams and 8,000 goats and this and that and the other. But what does the Lord require? Do justice and love kindness, walk humbly with God. And I think that walk humbly with God is an incredibly important piece that I try to remember, because I have that posted in several places, in cross-stitch and other places in my house and in my office. Because as soon as we get arrogant about our justice and advocacy, then we've become works righteous folks who've completely jettisoned the gospel. And we've also become perhaps the epitome of exclusion when we value, so we say, inclusion as much as possible, because we exclude people that we deem to be exclusive. And this church is, in many ways, still in this kind of crazy experiment that if anybody's going to pull off, it's going to have to be the Lutherans, who live in tension and dialectic and saint and sinner, grace and judgment, law and gospel. It's always there. And so we've got to be careful to bring all voices to the table. And quite honestly, I sometimes fear, and I've expressed this and will continue to at Conference of Bishops, that with all of the other realities of culture that crush in on the church as much as anything else, that in many ways we only invite certain voices to the table as the ELCA, and I think that we simply can't do that. We've got to continue, and I know in North Carolina, if we do that, we're gonna keep splitting off and keep having disaffiliations. If we can't talk to each other, know one another, be in relationship, that's the walking humbly part. And so back to the source. So what would love tell us about what's the best way to go here? What would mercy, what would justice tell us is the best way to go here? And maybe you decide a different way than I do, but we don't decide that or demonize or exclude on either side of arguments. Go back and look at some of the really wonderful social statements over the years that our church has and are continuing to produce. They always remind us, on the one hand, on the other hand, we're struggling with these realities, but to be in the struggle and in the conversation is absolutely critical, and so we're committed to that. I have 6 seconds left, says the counter, so I'm done. So at lunchtime, if you look for the little posters that are going to be in the middle of several tables, we'll have some Synod staff people. If you want to unpack, question, challenge, encourage, learn more about this vision piece for us, please, when you go to lunch today, find one of those tables with the banner, right? And we'll be there, and we'll be happy to talk to you. So it's in process. Thanks. You've already seen Vice President Diana Haywood here, but I want to tell you, she's an amazing woman, and she presides at our Synod Council meetings, and we split up the presiding here for all kinds of reasons at this gathering. But I didn't introduce her earlier, and you figured out probably along the way who she is. But she's been our vice president for several years, and just does a tremendous amount, doing a lot with our youth gathering now. So Diana, thank you. We appreciate you. You coming over here?